Welcome back, all you lovely people. I hope you had a nice little break there. So we're continuing on now. Just recall again, once again, we're in Unit 3 of the course. I know we've come so far. Unit 3 of the course, where we're thinking about, do the interests of others matter? And I've just now presented Ayn Rand's answer to that question. The interests of others should not matter to you. The morally right thing to do is to be prudent and focus on satisfying or meeting your own interests. And by extension, we see a pretty, I think, again, spicy claim here. Spicy still doesn't mean anything. Making altruistic sacrifices, she said, is morally wrong. And we'll see what she means by that. But again, she's saying be prudent. That's the morally right thing to do. And being altruistic, that is actually morally wrong. Whoa. So again, that's a statement, a very spicy statement of ethical egoism, which is, again, ethical egoism is the theory of morality claiming that a person should always act according to prudence and never altruistically sacrifice their interests for those of another. And as I mentioned, we're going to be primarily focusing on a pretty strong version of ethical egoism, claiming that a person and that person alone determines their own interests. And so they can never be wrong about what those interests are. And so we talked about that. And then just as always to remind us, when I'm speaking of prudence, I mean, of course, a general responsiveness to one's own interests. And so prudence is a general concern with self-interest. And when I speak of altruism, again, just so we remember, is what do I mean by altruism? Well, altruism is a general responsiveness to the interests of others, even when doing so may require the sacrifice of one's own interests. So yet, putting it all together, yet again, we're looking at ethical egoism. Again, ethical egoism, the theory of morality claiming that a person should always act according to prudence and never be altruistic in sacrificing their interests for another person. So we're no longer doing psychology, as I mentioned. We're looking at a normative theory of ethics about how we should behave. So this isn't psychological. This isn't descriptive. This is about how we do behave. And as I did before with psychological egoism, I think it's pretty good to kind of just start off with, well, what is prudent self-interest here? What does Ayn Rand mean by, prudent self-interest? What is it that we're supposed to be promoting and going after in ourselves? And I think it's pretty clear what Ayn Rand means by this, because she uses this phrase, the word happiness, right? She thinks prudent self-interest is your happiness. That's what you should be after. Because if you look at the reading, you'll see she just keeps saying things like about how the achievement of your happiness is the only moral purpose to your life, right? That's her ethical egoism. Your happiness is all that matters. Of course, you might just wonder then, well, good. So prudent self-interest is happiness. Fair enough. But what do we mean by happiness? We'd like a little more detail, at least, because happiness might be all sorts of different things. And I think we see her definition of happiness. I think it comes out throughout the passage, but I think she's the most direct about what she means by happiness on page 1014. So 1014, again, this is a big book that we're reading from. And this is where she says on 1014, happiness is the successful state of life. Happiness is the state of consciousness which proceeds from the achievement of one's values. So in kind of fancy pants language, we would say that her notion of happiness is preference satisfaction. Happiness is satisfying your values and your preferences. And that's preference satisfaction, the theory of preference satisfaction. But happiness is satisfying your own values and your own preferences. Or maybe you can put it even simpler. Happiness is getting whatever it is you want, right? And that's satisfying your values, your preferences, getting what you want. So we can actually be even more specific now. Yes, Ayn Rand is an ethical egoist. She thinks, again, you should be prudent and not be altruistic. But we can even be more specific. She is a preference satisfaction ethical egoist, because she's clear what she means by prudence in this case. So we can even flesh it out that this preference satisfaction ethical egoism says a person should always act in such a way as to satisfy their own values and preferences. So we just, that's what we did there. We just fleshed out what we meant by prudent self-interest. Yeah, that preference, satisfaction, ethical egoism just says, again, this is what Ayn Rand believes, preference, satisfaction, ethical egoism, a person should always act to promote their own values and their own preferences. Okay, so that's her view. And I think you see this idea throughout her argument that, again, your self-interest, your prudent self-interest is always, she's calling happiness. She thinks that's just obvious. We call, your self-interest is just best described as happiness. Okay, fair enough. And what is happiness then? Happiness is, again, satisfying your values and your preferences. And yeah, so that is getting whatever it is you want. And so Ayn Rand's ethical egoism, this preference satisfaction egoism, says you should, hey, go get whatever it is you want. Whatever it is you want, her morality says, go get it. So live life, man. See, or woman, people, students of Professor Gray, she says, live life, seize high life by the horns and live it to the fullest, man. It'll be awesome. But notice something interesting here, though. Something I think that's often ignored in her theory, so we can be honest about it at least. Preference satisfaction does not mean that you have to be a cruel, egotistical, cold person. You can, under this preference satisfaction ethical egoism, hey, it will turn out, and I'll explain how, but it will turn out that it's perfectly acceptable for you to feel pity for other people. It'll be perfectly acceptable for you to help the poor. But what Ayn Rand would say is that, look, if you value helping other people, Ayn Rand won't stop you. So again, she would say, if you value helping other people, if you have a preference for helping people, then go ahead, feel pity for others, and go ahead and help the poor, because those are your values and your preferences. So satisfy them. If your values and preferences involve helping other people, fine. We find happiness in many different things. And if you find happiness, if you satisfy your values for helping others, then of course, go do it. Ayn Rand will not stop you. But, and this is the important part for Ayn Rand, because I don't think Ayn Rand ever gave a dime to the poor or to charity. You can prove me wrong, tweet me, prove me wrong, but that's my understanding, is she never gave a dime to the poor, because she also says with this view of happiness, if helping other people does not make you happy, if helping other people does not satisfy your values and preferences, then don't help other people. And it would be wrong for anyone to force you to help other people. So again, her view is that you cannot force people against their will. So if you can help the poor, if that's what you truly want to do, then do it. But you do have no obligation to help the poor if you don't care about the poor. Again, Rand says you get to decide what you value. If it's helping the poor, then help the poor. But if you don't care about the poor, then buy a car. I don't know. Spend the money on what it is you do value. So she's making it a personal choice about satisfying, again, your values, your preferences, what it is that makes you happy. That's what her morality says to do. So yeah, never sacrifice anything for others. That's altruism. Don't do it. And she's quite clear that's for suckers. She reread it. Look at the word. She says altruistic people are suckers. And so this is, again, goes back to her whole rejection of paternalism. Again, paternalism is, having others tell you what to do and then demand that from you, even if you disagree with it. So again, adults cannot treat you like a child. You are not a child. You are an adult. And if you want to spend your money on a car, those are your values and preferences. No one can force you to donate to the poor. That would be morally wrong. So Rand, though, at least with this, can avoid it being completely cruel philosophy, because if you do care about the poor, then go for it. But you don't have to. No one's going to make you. But I think, so maybe she resolves that. I'll let you decide on that. If everyone just buys cars, is that cool? Because we all like cars. I don't know, but I'll let you think about it. But I think her preference satisfaction view might be creating actually at least a mild major. I'll let you decide. I like letting you guys decide. There's definitely a challenge, though, with this preference satisfaction view. Because the idea is, remember, with preference satisfaction, the focus is on satisfying your values, your preferences. It's going after whatever it is you want. But we get an interesting question here. Where do your values and preferences come from? How do you decide this? Because suppose, and some of us maybe feel this way. We genuinely don't know if we should help the poor or not. We don't know what we value in this case. Do I value helping the poor? Do I value that car? I don't know. That's a tough call, maybe. For some of you, maybe that's an easy choice. For others, though, you might actually struggle with that question. And so the question I'm asking is, how do you decide what it is you value and prefer? Ethical egoism doesn't help you at all here. Ethical egoism says, satisfy your values, satisfy your preferences, but it doesn't tell you what your values and preferences should be. It gives you no advice on this point. In short, again, preference satisfaction, ethical egoism doesn't tell me what values and preferences I should have. Again, it just says once you have them, act on them, satisfy them. But again, if you honestly don't know whether you should help the poor or buy the car, it doesn't tell you anything. It just says do whatever you want. And I'm like, well, I don't know what I want to do. These are two hard choices here. Help me. So again, it doesn't help you specify what it is you should go after. And I think that is kind of weird for an ethical theory, because remember, ethical theory is all about the practical question, what ought I to do? And in this case, if you're uncertain about what it is you value, ethical egoism is silent. It offers no help. And so that seems kind of weird, that an ethical theory about what it is we should live and do and value, it's ethical egoism on a preference satisfaction. Ethical egoism is completely silent. And so I think that is a challenge then for Ayn Rand's acceptance of preference satisfaction. But I should note that an ethical egoist, can define prudent self-interest in other ways. It doesn't have to be preference satisfaction. For instance, some people might think that prudent self-interest and happiness really are just pleasure. I think we mentioned this in the previous module. Maybe it's just pleasure. Not preference satisfaction, but feelings of pleasure. And in this case, okay, prudent self-interest is happiness, happiness is pleasure. And so then we could get what's known as a hedonistic ethical egoism, hedonism, the desire of pleasure. And the hedonistic ethical egoism just says a person should always act in such a way as to, increase their own pleasure. So I'm not after satisfying my preferences now, I'm after making myself feel more pleasure. And maybe that's really what happiness is just feeling that pleasure. That makes sense to some people, I think, with hedonism. But clearly, Ayn Rand actually does not like hedonism. She actually says why she does not like hedonism. She doesn't like this emphasis on pleasure. And this is on page 1014. She says, man's life as required by his nature is not the life of a mindless brute, but the life of a thinking being, life by means of achievement, not survival at any price, since there's only one price that pays for man's survival, reason. So what she is saying here is we need a notion of prudent self-interest that is rational and not a mindless feeling like pleasure is. Again, she's emphasizing achievement. That's, again, prudent self-interest, happiness. This is achieving things. Again, using one's reason to satisfy one's values and preferences. So we're back. She really wants to go back to preference satisfaction. She does not want to be a mindless brute after, hedonistic pleasure. No, something greater involving values and preferences that one's reason can make sense of. Now, this might lead us to think, well, maybe we can then actually have a slightly different view of what counts as prudent self-interest or what counts as happiness. And this might be some kind of notion of enlightened self-interest. And so enlightened self-interest, I can't have a pithy definition for enlightened self-interest, but I can tell you what kind of egoism we can get from that, because we can get what's known as rational ethical egoism. And this is the idea that a person should always act in such a way as to promote their own long-term interests like health. So maybe smoking is bad on this enlightened self-interest, which is, again, looking for more longer-term interests rather than short-term gratification. We use our reason to figure out what's really valuable and act on that instead. But I think Ayn Rand won't like this either. I think she's starting to think this looks a little too paternalistic, because others could start telling you what's in your long-term interest. You're smoking, you're not bothering anyone, you're making sure you're outside, not secondhand smoke for anyone else, but you love those cigarettes, you want to live fast, die young, whatever, right? Live hard, die young, whatever it is. You want to do that? That's your choice, Ayn Rand says. But someone might come out and say, it's not in your long-term, rational, enlightened self-interest to be smoking those cigarettes. And Ayn Rand is like, go to hell. I'm living my life. You live your life. I'll live mine. Thank you very much. So again, she doesn't like paternalism, because you tell someone not to smoke, she would say you're treating an adult like they are a child. That adult probably knows pretty full well cigarettes ain't good for them, but it's their call. Their decision. So Ayn Rand really wants to stick with preference, satisfaction, ethical egoism. Again, preference, satisfaction. A person should always act so as that they satisfy their values, their preferences. And this gives you the freedom, the absolute freedom to choose whatever it is you value, and then, of course, live it, pursue it. But again, we're back now at that challenge I just mentioned a little bit ago about what is it that we should value. If you're unsure about what it is to value, help the poor, buy the car. Ayn Rand does not tell you. And I guess that's a challenge she is willing to bear, because she just thinks preference satisfaction is better than hedonism and pleasure, better than some kind of enlightened, rational self-interest that others can use against you. In any case, I think now we have a sense of what Ayn Rand means by prudent self-interest. It's your happiness, and your happiness is preference satisfaction, so you should always act to satisfy your values and preferences. And so that's her view of ethical egoism, resting on preference satisfaction. Okay, I think I've talked about that more than enough. As always, I like to talk clearly. Let's take another quick break, and then I'll present Ayn Rand's defense and justification for her views of ethical egoism. So I'll see you right back here in a moment.